The stage of the View shimmered under the bright studio lights, an artificial sun that made every smile sharper and every glare more piercing. The audience buzzed with that peculiar electricity that only comes when a special guest is about to be unveiled. Cameras swiveled on their tracks, floor directors gestured sharply, and the hosts settled into their seats with the ease of veterans who knew the choreography of live television by heart. At the center of it all sat Keanu Reeves, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that managed to look both understated and effortlessly stylish. His long dark hair brushed against his shoulders, framing a face that seemed carved from both steel and sorrow. He had agreed to appear on The View to discuss his latest project, an independent film about resilience and redemption, but he also carried with him an aura of privacy, a shield against the probing nature of celebrity talk shows. Keanu was not one to chase the spotlight. Instead, the spotlight seemed to follow him, illuminating both his artistry and his guarded humanity. At first, the conversation was light, banter about his film, laughter over anecdotes from his career, the kind of warm pleasantries that audiences expected. But beneath the smiles, there was a tension, subtle yet undeniable, as if the air itself anticipated a clash that had not yet erupted. Joy Behar leaned forward in her chair, her signature glasses catching the reflection of the studio lights. She had always been the firebrand of the panel, the one unafraid to push boundaries, to provoke, to test the patience of her guests for the sake of ratings and relevance. Her questions, wrapped in humor but sharpened like arrows, often landed where they stung most. As Keanu described the themes of hope and perseverance in his new film, Joy's smirk lingered, as though she was waiting for her moment to interject. And then it came, a pivot from the film to the man himself. She leaned in closer, her voice carrying that mix of playfulness and bite that made her beloved by some and reviled by others. "You know, Keanu," she began, "people say you're this mysterious, almost too good to be true figure in Hollywood. But come on, nobody's that perfect. Isn't it time you drop the act and let people see who you really are?" The audience gave a polite chuckle, but the weight of her words pressed against the set like an invisible hand. What was meant to be lighthearted felt more like a strike, a demand that carried undertones of accusation. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the edge in her voice, but no one stepped in, not yet. Keanu's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but for those who knew him, the change was seismic. The faint smile that had played at his lips dimmed, and his dark eyes seemed to retreat inward, as if searching for composure in a storm he hadn't asked to face. He took a measured breath, the kind of breath one takes before answering with restraint instead of impulse. "I don't think of it as an act," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "I just choose to keep certain parts of my life private. What you see is me. It's not about being perfect, it's about being true to myself." His words were deliberate, respectful, but the undercurrent was clear. He would not be bullied into baring his soul for entertainment. Yet, Joy wasn't finished. She leaned back, theatrically rolling her eyes as the audience gave a mix of laughs and gasps. "Oh, come on, Keanu. You've made a career out of being the brooding, untouchable guy. But don't you think fans deserve more than just the silent mystique? Don't they deserve the real you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown across a dueling ground. The atmosphere thickened. What had begun as a routine interview was now teetering on the edge of confrontation. The studio audience, sensing the brewing storm, grew restless, some shifting in their seats, others whispering in anticipation. The co-hosts glanced between Joy and Keanu, their smiles frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the drama unfold. Keanu's silence stretched for a beat too long, and the cameras caught every flicker of emotion across his face. The flicker of restraint, the tightening of his jaw, the faint furrow in his brow. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resonant, carrying the gravity of someone who had endured far more than what a daytime talk show could throw at him. "Respectfully," he said, locking eyes with Joy, "my fans don't come to me for gossip. They come for the work, for the films, the stories, the art. That's what I give them. That's what I've always given them." His tone was still calm, but beneath it was a firmness that demanded respect, a quiet declaration that his boundaries were not up for debate. But Joy, ever the provocateur, refused to let the moment settle. She leaned forward once again, her voice rising just enough to pierce the hush that had settled over the room. "So you're saying we should just accept the facade? That you'll never open up? Never show people what's really going on behind the cool, stoic mask?" The word mask was the spark that lit the fuse. It wasn't just a question, it was a dismissal of his authenticity, a suggestion that the man sitting before them was nothing more than a performance. Keanu's eyes, usually gentle and reflective, hardened with a rare flash of steel. The room seemed to tilt in that instant, as though everyone collectively realized they had crossed into uncharted territory. What followed would not just be another daytime TV soundbite. It would be the moment Keanu Reeves, the man so often lauded for his grace under pressure, began to push back against a system that thrived on stripping away dignity for spectacle. The silence that followed Joy's cutting remark was unlike any silence the set of The View had ever held before. Normally, even awkward pauses were patched with laughter, applause, or a quick change of topic. But now, the air was heavy, thick with the kind of tension that makes people lean forward on their couches at home. Every eye in the studio fixed on Keanu Reeves, and every lens zoomed in closer, hungry to catch his reaction. His face, illuminated by the unforgiving studio lights, carried no smile, no trace of his usual quiet warmth. Instead, there was a stillness about him, like the calm just before a storm surge swallows the shore. The co-host shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi Goldberg, usually the balancing voice of reason, cleared her throat as if to break the moment, but Joy raised her hand subtly, claiming the space as her own. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Look, Keanu, Joy pressed, her tone tightening. We live in a world where celebrities can't just hide behind a wall. People want transparency. They want to know the real person behind the fame. Otherwise, aren't you just... What's the word? She tapped her glasses, feigning thought, then snapped her fingers. A hollow image. A projection. The words hit like darts, each syllable barbed with implication. The audience gasped, the collective intake of breath audible even through the hot air of the studio lights. To accuse Keanu Reeves, an actor beloved not just for his films, but for his humility, his humanity, his quiet acts of kindness, of being hollow was almost sacrilegious. Yet Joy delivered it with a smirk, a dare, as though daring him to crack, to show that the unshakable, soft-spoken man could be provoked like anyone else. Keanu's jaw flexed, his hands tightening against the armrests of his chair, the only visible betrayal of the storm brewing inside. He had spent decades deflecting invasive questions, dancing gracefully around the traps of fame, never allowing himself to become tabloid fodder. But this was different. This wasn't curiosity, it was hostility. His voice, when it came, was no longer wrapped in the velvet calm of Scene 1. It was sharper, edged with a weight that cut through the air like glass. With all due respect, Joy, he said, each word deliberate. I've lived more life than most headlines can ever tell. I've lost people I loved. I've seen things I wouldn't wish on anyone. And yet, I show up, for the work, for the audience, for the art. If you think that makes me a projection, then maybe it says more about the way you look at people than the way I live my life. The studio erupted, not in applause, not in laughter, but in a stunned murmur that rippled like a wave through the seats. Joy's smirk faltered, if only for a heartbeat, but her pride would not allow her to retreat. Instead, she leaned into the tension, her voice rising with performative indignation. So what? We're not allowed to ask questions. This is The View, Keanu. We ask the tough stuff. That's the deal when you sit in that chair. You can't just give us polished lines and expect us to clap. Her words rang with authority, but the audience wasn't fully with her this time. There were scattered boos among the gasps, faint but audible, a sign that the crowd's sympathy was shifting. Whoopi shifted in her seat again, her eyes darting between Keanu and Joy, calculating whether to intervene. But Keanu was no longer the man in need of defense. His presence had changed. His shoulders squared, his gaze hardened, and the weight of his voice carried not just across the studio, but through the cameras and into the homes of millions watching. I didn't come here for applause, Keanu said, his voice low yet thunderous in its gravity. I came here to talk about something meaningful. But if what you want is to tear people down to fill airtime, then maybe I'm on the wrong stage. His words cut through the air like a blade, and the audience responded instantly. Applause this time, loud and defiant, rising up in support of the man they had admired for decades. The clapping rattled the set, a direct challenge to Joy's provocation. She pursed her lips, clearly rattled but unwilling to concede. Well, she shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm, maybe you are on the wrong stage. That was the match against the powder keg. Keanu's eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and for the first time in his long career of interviews, he let the storm inside him break loose. The camera caught it all, the flicker of anger, the resolve in his posture, as he began to rise from his chair. The audience roared, sensing they were witnessing history unfold, a collision of restraint and provocation that had finally tipped past the point of no return. The moment Keanu rose from his chair, the studio shifted from tense to electric. Audiences of The View were accustomed to fiery debates, but never had they witnessed something like this. The camera operators scrambled to adjust their angles, the red tally lights glowing as they tracked his every move. The audience gasped collectively, then erupted into a chaotic mixture of cheers, applause, and murmurs. Some rose to their feet, sensing they were about to see a television moment that would live in headlines for days. Others sat frozen, hands clasped over their mouths, not wanting to miss a single breath of what was unfolding. On the stage, Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, her smirk still painted across her lips, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something different now. Not triumph, but unease. This was no longer witty banter gone sharp. This was a storm, and she had stirred it too far. Keanu stood tall, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the polished desk. His hands, usually relaxed and humble, now trembled slightly at his sides, though not from weakness. It was the tremor of controlled fury, the kind born when years of restraint finally snap under pressure. His voice, when he spoke, resonated through the room like the toll of a bell. "You talk about masks, Joy," he said, turning to face her fully. "But maybe the real mask is pretending cruelty is just tough questioning. Maybe the mask is hiding behind a desk, calling it entertainment while trying to tear people apart." His words echoed in the rafters, each syllable ricocheting through the studio. The audience exploded into applause, thunderous, relentless, almost drowning him out. Joy opened her mouth to reply, but her voice was swallowed by the roar, her authority diluted in the face of the crowd's overwhelming reaction. Whoopi Goldberg raised her hands, her deep voice cutting through the noise in a rare plea. All right, let's take a breath here. Let's bring it down." But the energy couldn't be contained. The other hosts exchanged glances of disbelief, clutching their note cards like shields in the crossfire. This wasn't just another headline-generating spat. This was a fracture in the very structure of the show. Keanu shook his head slowly, as if the entire stage, the entire format, no longer held meaning for him. His face bore no smile, no sign of politeness, only a raw clarity that silenced even the most restless whispers. "I've given my whole life to storytelling," he said, his tone steady but cutting, "and yet here I am, reduced to defending my humanity on daytime television. If this is what passes for discourse, then maybe we've lost more than we realize." The words hit like a hammer, not just at Joy, but at the entire machinery of media. For a fleeting moment, there was silence, heavy, crushing silence that made the lights above seem harsher, the air thicker. Then, with a movement that would etch itself into television history, Keanu turned away from the desk. The cameras followed him as he pushed back his chair with a sharp scrape against the floor. The sound carried like a gunshot, punctuating his decision. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuffs with quiet dignity, and began walking toward the stage exit. The audience erupted again, some shouting, "We love you, Keanu," while others clapped furiously, a standing ovation forming in waves across the studio. The security crew and floor managers exchanged frantic signals, unsure whether to stop him, unsure whether they even could. The hosts sat stunned, their faces caught in various stages of disbelief. Joy attempted to laugh it off, her voice cracking with forced bravado. "Oh, come on, Keanu, it's just a show," she shouted after him. But her words fell flat, her tone brittle against the tidal wave of support echoing from the audience. As Keanu reached the edge of the stage, he paused briefly, his hand resting on the curtain. The camera zoomed in, desperate to capture one last expression, one final statement before he vanished behind a velvet drape. He turned slightly, his profile framed against the stage lights. His eyes, usually soft and distant, now burned with conviction. "It might be just a show," he said without raising his voice, yet every word carried to the last row, "but I'm not here to play a part in tearing people down." With that, he pushed through the curtain, vanishing into the backstage shadows. The studio was left in stunned silence for a beat, then erupted once again, this time in cheers that drowned out even the theme music hastily played by the producers in a desperate attempt to regain control. Joy sat rigid at the desk, her face drained of color, her hands gripping her note cards until they crumpled. The storm had broken, and Keanu Reeves had walked straight through it, leaving the set, the hosts, and the audience forever changed. Backstage, the energy was nothing short of pandemonium. Producers sprinted across the narrow hallways, headsets pressed tightly to their ears, voices cracking as they tried to contain what had just unraveled on live television. The studio staff, usually a well-oiled machine, now looked like a hive rattled by a sudden storm. Stagehands whispering frantically, assistants shuffling cue cards that were no longer relevant, security staff debating whether to follow Keanu or let him walk unimpeded. The tension bled from the set into the corridors, and every second ticked like thunder. Keanu stood at the edge of it all, his back against the cool brick wall, his head tilted slightly upward as though grounding himself against the chaos. The polished charm of the Hollywood star was gone. Here he was simply a man, breathing hard, trying to gather his thoughts in the wake of a confrontation that had shaken the room to its core. But then came the sound, a producer's voice, sharp and panicked. "Do you realize what just happened? Do you realize the feed's already trending?" Within minutes, the fallout had burst beyond the confines of the studio. News outlets, blogs, and Twitter feeds ignited like wildfire. Clips of the showdown were already circulating online, edited into bite-sized reels with captions like "Keanu versus Joy," "The showdown no one saw coming," and "Keanu Reeves walks out live on The View." Hashtags sprang up like sparks. Hashtag Keanu storms off. Hashtag respect Keanu. Hashtag Joy crossed the line. Even as Keanu stood backstage, seeking silence, the world outside was already dissecting every word, every glance, every gesture. Some anchors called it the most shocking daytime moment of the decade. Others framed it as the collapse of Hollywood's nice guy image. But overwhelmingly, the tide of public sentiment swelled in his favor. Thousands of fans posted clips of his words, praising his defense of dignity, applauding him for standing against what they called toxic media theatrics. The media machine that Joy had tried to control had spun entirely out of her hands, and now it roared in Keanu's direction, not as an attack, but as a wave of vindication. Meanwhile, in the dressing rooms, conversations burned. One co-host whispered to another, "Did she really think she could push him that far?" Another shook her head, her voice trembling with disbelief. She wanted ratings. Well, she got them, but not the kind she hoped for. Producers debated whether to apologize, to spin the incident, or to let it ride as a raw and unfiltered moment of television. But Keanu, calm now, interrupted the flurry of strategizing when a young assistant approached him hesitantly, her phone trembling in her hands. "Mr. Reeves," she stammered, "you need to see this." On the glowing screen, a flood of supportive messages filled the timeline. Celebrities, journalists, and ordinary fans alike, all praising his composure and condemning the attack. A trending video showed the audience rising to their feet, chanting his name as he walked off stage, framed like a hero refusing to bow to cruelty. For the first time since he'd left the stage, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, not of arrogance, but of recognition. His choice to walk away had not been weakness. It had been strength. Joy, on the other hand, was left sitting at the desk, her smirk shattered, her eyes darting nervously toward the producers off camera. When the show cut to commercial, she ripped off her mic with a sharp tug, muttering under her breath about snowflake celebrities and thin skin. But her words found no audience backstage. Instead, the narrative was already writing itself, carried not by her retorts but by the millions online who had taken Keanu's side. By the time she left the stage, news alerts were chiming on every phone in the building. CNN, Keanu Reeves walks off The View after fiery exchange. Entertainment Tonight, fans rally behind Reeves in talk show clash. Social media polls showed overwhelming support. 90% stood with Keanu. What had begun as a provocation had transformed into a cultural flashpoint, and Joy was on the losing side. As the frenzy grew, Keanu finally broke his silence backstage. Surrounded by producers begging him for comment, he raised a hand and spoke with the same calm he had carried into the interview, though now tempered by an edge of finality. "I don't regret standing up," he said simply. "If television needs to survive on tearing people apart, then maybe it's time someone walks away. Today, that was me." The words, though spoken in private, would soon find their way into headlines, quoted and replayed as the definitive statement of the day. It wasn't just an outburst. It wasn't just a walkout. It was a declaration. Keanu Reeves refusing to bow to the spectacle, refusing to let his humanity be reduced to ratings. And as the world watched, dissected and debated, one truth rang louder than the noise. The man who had walked off that stage had also walked into history. The morning after the broadcast, New York City woke beneath a storm of headlines. Newspaper kiosks carried bold block letters above images of Keanu standing mid-stage, his body half-turned as he prepared to walk away, his face set in defiance. Every network replayed the clip, looping his words, "I'm not here to play a part in tearing people down," like a mantra. Talk radio buzzed with callers weighing in, most of them siding with the actor. Online, the tide had become a tidal wave, millions of views on the confrontation clip, countless think pieces praising Keanu for defending his dignity, and hashtags still dominating global trends. What was meant to be just another episode of The View had become an international conversation about respect, celebrity culture, and the cruelty often hidden under the guise of tough questioning. And at the center of the firestorm sat Joy Behar, whose confidence from the day before had already begun to crumble. By noon, Joy's name was plastered across Twitter in less flattering ways than she could have imagined. Hashtag Joy crossed the line was trending, alongside memes of her eye roll spliced against footage of Keanu's solemn walkout. Commentators on YouTube uploaded side-by-side breakdowns of the exchange, pausing to highlight the exact moment the audience turned against her. Even fellow entertainers, many of whom had their own fraught histories with invasive questioning, weighed in. One late-night host quipped, "Joy Behar tried to break Keanu Reeves, but she only broke her own career for the week." Another tweeted simply, "Respect is not optional. Team Keanu." Each comment drove the knife deeper, turning what Joy had intended as clever provocation into an act of professional self-sabotage. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere at ABC grew grim. Executives convened emergency meetings, weighing the fallout. Sponsors were calling, not yet threatening to pull out, but voicing concerns. Producers of The View issued carefully crafted statements about valuing spirited discussion, while acknowledging the importance of respect. But no amount of corporate polish could dull the sting of public opinion. Inside her dressing room, Joy sat slumped, her phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications she no longer wanted to read. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of isolation, not from her co-hosts, not from the producers, but from the very audience she had always counted on. The laughter, the applause, the validation, all of it had turned. She had wanted a headline. Instead, she had made herself the villain of a story too big to control. Meanwhile, Keanu carried on with quiet grace. Paparazzi caught glimpses of him strolling through Manhattan, dressed simply in jeans and a leather jacket, offering polite nods to fans who shouted encouragement from across the street. He declined interviews, ignored reporters' questions, and kept his focus on the project that had brought him onto The View in the first place. His silence only amplified the respect he was receiving. Commentators praised him for not capitalizing on the drama, for walking away not only from the show but from the circus of self-defense that usually followed such moments. "Keanu Reeves doesn't need to win the argument," one columnist wrote. "He won by refusing to play the game." The piece went viral, cementing his image not as a fragile celebrity who couldn't take criticism, but as a man unwilling to let his humanity become fodder for spectacle. For Joy, however, the days that followed grew darker. Each attempt to brush off the incident on subsequent broadcasts rang hollow. Her jokes fell flat, her quips landed with thuds, and the studio audience, once quick to laugh, now offered polite, reserved chuckles. Producers noticed. Ratings analysts noticed. And most painfully, Joy noticed. The regret settled in not with a single headline or a single critical tweet, but with the absence of the energy she had always commanded so easily. The instant applause, the knowing laughs, the feeling of being in control, all of it had evaporated in the shadow of one moment. And late at night, scrolling through videos of the walkout, watching the audience rise to its feet as Keanu exited, Joy faced the truth she had tried to ignore. She hadn't broken him. She had broken herself.